everybody. Welcome back to Real Talk. After our summer break, we had a couple weeks off there. So now we're back at you with some more podcast episodes. So today we are joined by Rick Ludwig and Diane Vanderwoude. Russel, I guess. I don't know if you go by Vanderwoude or Russel now, but
kind of both. So
you nailed it, man.
So, just transitioning still.
Transitioning.
So we're going to talk about grief today and dealing with grief and stuff like that. And we welcome you guys from Kitching, Steepe Ludwig Funeral Home. Rick is the owner and Diane is a funeral director, as I understand. But we'll get you guys to introduce yourself. So maybe I can go nuts.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're excited to be here. It's our first podcast, and hey, we're going national, so we're excited about that.
It's a lot of fun.
And this could be the start of something big. So we're both funeral directors. I'm a funeral director now, licensed over 25 years. My start in funeral service, not to be overly dramatic, was a love story. I met my wife now, Denise, in high school. I started dating her, and as I came home to her home for dinners and so on, her father was a funeral director, and so you started to hear stories around the table and what he did. Obviously, my interest was piqued just from a human interest point of view to see, well, what's this all about? And he had a small family-run funeral home, and it wasn't long before he said, hey, I could use a hand with something. Could you do this? Could you do that? And before we knew it, I had a part-time job on the weekend, covering the phones at the funeral home, doing odd work, non-funeral director work as a support staff. And I was really not only intrigued, but I kind of fell in love with not only my wife, but also her dad's business. And I was just impressed at his position in the community, and not only the church community, but the community he lived in, where you're sort of in this sort of quietly central place where everyone ends up coming to some degree, right? Someone has died and the community comes around that. And to see the dignity that was not only afforded his position, but also in the work that he did, how he honored people who had died and also looked after their families. There seemed to be a tremendous reward in that people really appreciated what he did. And then I can honestly say, probably, I remember my first time I saw a Legion service, and a Legion service is when a veteran has died and members from the Legion come together for an evening prayer service, which has some recitations and poems similar to a Legion service you would see at a cenotaph. And then after they've done some readings and some prayers, there's a time where you stand quietly and listen to the last post being played, and then all the veterans go up and place a poppy on the casket, on the front rail of it. And the solemnity of that and the significance of it that just grabbed me. Like, this is something I need to be part of. This is really important.
Yeah.
When someone dies, there needs to be an opportunity for people to stop, pay some attention, put some sense around it, appeal to God for help with it, but then also really honor the life of the person that was lived, and then as a group go forward from there. So it just grabbed my heart, but also my mind, and I took a circuitous route from there to become a funeral director, but after going to university and doing some different things, but never regretted it. It's been a passion of mine ever since.
Wow, interesting. Quite the sales pitch. I want to change careers all of a sudden. Yeah,
that seems to be a common thread with funeral directors. But I read Diane, on your bio that you always wanted to be a funeral director. So, what's your story?
Yeah, so mine started when I was 8 years old. My brother Justin died, in 1994, and that was when I think just watching my family go through it and the respect, it was Henry who was actually the funeral director then, just the respect that my family had for him and the trust they placed in him to, look after things for our family. And then also part of me, I think, was a little bit fascinated by it, like just in the sense of who are these people that, they wear these suits and they don't seem to say a whole ton, but yet they seem to get a lot done and seem to communicate well with each other, and their cars are always super clean. And I think I was just a little bit fascinated by the whole funeral world. And then knew I wanted to be a part of it somehow, whether in the bereavement aspect but then ultimately going to school for funeral services, then learned that no, my passion is really to be on the funeral directing side of it, not just with, working with families and running services, arranging services, but also the other side of things too. Like our job has kind of a lot of different facets to it. So
Mm-hmm.
been licensed over 16 years now, and I wouldn't change it at all. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Wow. That's cool. I mean, yeah, it seems to be something for me that it's hard to imagine a world where I would want to get into it, but it's been, very well appreciated. Like every time I've had, even at funeral homes, but then also, going through, funerals and things like, it's definitely something that is well appreciated, at least in our community. That,
We hear that a lot. A lot of people say to us, "I'd never want to do your job, but I'm glad you do it."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
So you get,
exactly,
and we understand that it is a unique job, caring for the dead and caring for the living. And today we're going to be talking about grief, which is much more the living side of it.
Yeah.
But certainly the care of the dead is an important part of it too. And I think people in funeral service that we know take that very seriously, and that responsibility too. That it's a sacred trust.
Yeah. How different is that from, just maybe briefly going to that, like how different is that from, I guess, a worldly view? Like in our Christian churches, like people expect you to have, I guess, some form of, respect for their loved one. Is there a difference between that and how, like a secular funeral home would deal with the dead in that situation? Or?
Yeah, I would say no. I think everybody, whether you have a Christian faith or a different faith or no faith at all, if you want to put it that way, everyone wants you to care for their mom or their dad or their sibling with respect and dignity. And how that all works itself out in the funeral will be different as to what people believe and what's important to them. But I think the care for the deceased is pretty universal. That everyone wants someone to look after their loved one in a dignified way. But each culture has its own practices around that too, that you have to be aware of and also understand and accommodate.
Definitely.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Well, today I guess we should talk about grief if we're going to get to that. And so maybe let's just start off with a bigger picture on grief. So what is grief? How do you guys look at that? And what is the grieving process like? How long is it? Just go to those sort of things. Maybe if you want to start with that, Rick.
Yeah, sure. We'll try to bounce that around a little bit. I think to step back from it, we often, of course, think about grief in relation to death, loss of a loved one, and which is obviously very important and probably one of the most significant things because it's irreversible in that sense in someone's life. But there's grief throughout our life because our life is full of starts and stops. That's the way it is in a broken world. There's nothing eternal other than our relationship with God right now. So we all have to cope with that, even from the start of our life. I was just thinking with my wife the other day, we were driving, and I said, even our little nephew, we have triplet nephew, 2 nephews and a niece, and they're a lot of fun. Spend time with him, but one of them he was the last. He had to give up his soother, right? And he's getting too old for it, and like, you're going to school, you can't be hanging on to this thing. Yeah. And he's very intuitive. He'll say like, well, what will make me happy?
Yeah.
But so getting rid of his soother was a big deal because that was something that he had a strong connection with, to pacify himself, to calm himself, to go to sleep with, and so on.
Sure.
So to take that away, there's a loss.
Yep.
And there's a grief with that. That's like, you can't fall asleep. You're upset. What do I replace this with?
Right.
And very much, I think the grieving process is us figuring out as human beings, we've lost something, we're hurt by that, or our life has been turned upside down in some way by it. How do we straighten ourselves out? Yep. How do we reorient ourselves so that we can carry on, that we can do that in a way that we're calm, we're able to function, and it just doesn't happen like that, right? No. There's some work that needs to be done to get there.
Yeah.
So I think that in a nutshell, and then you can see that grief is not just for death; it's a job loss. Relationships is huge, right? People have broken relationships.
For sure.
Even when you start dating, the worst thing is when you get dumped,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then you're like, oh man, you have this huge grief attack about it. Why, and how, and my life is over.
Yep.
And that just carries on into all the different segments of your life, and the tougher ones. So there's things that are embarrassing, like when you lose your status, or
Sure.
bankruptcy, things like that, where it's hard to face other people. And so you have complicated, you not only have your own loss, but how do you carry that out socially and in a way that you're comfortable and other people are comfortable to talk about it. And those are all the dynamics around grief. I think if you just start from a basic definition.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But then you get into death and dealing with the grief that comes with death.
Right.
Maybe you can speak to that, Diane.
Yeah, it's obviously different. Something that I know you kind of touched on that earlier about, like how long does it take or do you recover from it? I don't think that anyone recovers from it. I think that we learn to kind of carry the weight of it in a different way. And I think that that can make other people around someone who's grieving uncomfortable in the sense of people, we want to fix things. Like even you're talking about, someone gets broken up with, what do your friends do? They want to take you out. They want to cheer you up. They want to do that. But when it comes to losing a loved one, I think it's a bit different in the sense of we have to allow people to grieve and to go through the different steps that are involved in that.
Yeah.
So
could you speak to some of those steps? Is there any debate around what that all involves, or is that kind of a sort of a set thing?
Yeah, you know what? I think back, this is always I think whenever you start talking about something, I was thinking about this earlier, like if someone said, well, what if you were trying to describe joy? Because we look at joy and grief sort of as opposites of each other, right?
Right.
And we're kind of comfortable not to say, well, there's a whole bunch of stages for joy. You kind of start with, something interests you, and then all of a sudden you get really engaged, then you get elated, and then you have this sort of come down period. We just do it, right? Because there's nobody argues about it.
Yeah.
But grief is the opposite, where people are constantly trying to help you get over it, get past it, get through it. And so they're really attracted to know, okay, well, what would be the steps? And this was probably peaked a little bit in the 70s. Dr. Kubler-Ross did a big study on people who were dying, actually, not people who were grieving. So people who were facing their mortality and their own death in palliative care. And she identified out of that, there were 5 steps that those people went through: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So that was sort of the general curve she saw people go through, starting here, kind of descending, and then kind of coming up to this other side. And then what happened is, in a general way, the populace or culture took it over and said, well, this is grief.
This is
right?
grief. Yeah.
So if we just get these 5 steps done,
bada bing, bada boom,
then we're done, right?
and
my biggest thing is now, what step am I on? How much more do I have to do? And then all of a sudden they realize that, well, maybe this model doesn't even fit specifically grief, but it also doesn't happen in this orderly fashion. So why is it sometimes I can accept it and another day I'm fighting up against it again?
Right.
I'm having a hard time believing my loved one or my spouse or my friend died. And why am I revisiting this again?
Yeah.
Why am I back at that place? Am I failing in my grief?
Right.
Actually, no, you're just grieving.
mm-hmm.
Just like you're happy, but you're sad and you're grieving. And the grief is taking you on the place you need to be at that time.
Yeah.
As you're working through something, and it's often things that trigger it for you that might be another
memory,
someone else's, or a memory of an instant, or missing something even on someone else's behalf. You hear that sometimes when people say, they're at the graduation of their grandchildren and they're all upset and they're like, well, what's wrong? Well, your grandfather would have been so proud of you, and he's not here, and I just can't stop thinking about that.
Yeah.
So those are very common things, and I think what we need to do as a culture to help each other is to relieve each other of this pressure that grief needs to be recovered from. It needs to be experienced and it needs to be shared. And it does resolve itself to a point where I think that's a great way of Diane said that you can carry it.
Okay.
That you're not overburdened by it. Because there's times when you're overburdened by your grief and you need other people to help shoulder.
Yeah.
And then there's times you can carry it, and actually you become a person who slips your shoulder under someone else's grief.
Yeah.
And says, I know what you're going through. Yeah. Let me help you carry it for a little while.
Yeah.
And maybe it's in relating and talking about it and sharing some of the experiences.
Yeah.
Just being there.
Yeah. So is it kind of like, do you let your feelings go and just wherever your feelings take you? And then is there an end to that if you're trying to, like you say, carry that burden forward and accept it?
Well, I think there's, from my experience anyway, and I think some of my family members, when the death first happens, like it can be all consuming. it's all you think about.
Yeah.
It's not only just with all the funeral planning and everything, but even after that, when you're supposed to go back to normal life, it's not normal anymore. It's a whole new life. There's like the before this happened and after this happened. So I think, trying to adjust to that new normal we can be hard on ourselves too, right? Like, why am I not feeling better? Well, it's been half a year. Why am I still having a hard time with this or getting emotional every time I see certain people or hear a certain hymn? Within reason, we do have to go on with our lives in terms of our day-to-day things. And if we're unable to get out of bed and whatnot, then maybe some more, professional help would be useful. But I think just going through it day by day, not trying to see an end in sight. Like,
Okay.
in a year, I'm going to be this much better, because I feel, sometimes it's in the second year that I hear families actually have a harder time than in the first year. So I think it's just not trying to have everything sorted out as to exactly how it's going to go, because it's going to be different for everyone.
Yeah, I like what you said there, because you're right. You can't just be a puddle, or you can't just carry on in life with expressing everything you're feeling. You can't do that in any avenue of life, right? You have to think and internalize, process. That's part of functioning. So I would agree with Diane that there's times when people who are having difficult doing that at a period of time, that their grief might be compounded by other things that makes it very difficult for them to process it even well.
Okay.
If you have a lot of mental health struggles, it may a really acute grief could really compound that to say, well, I have a hard time coping with things normally, and now this is making it almost impossible.
Right.
So you might need help to sort that out, or trauma or things like that can really send someone into a place that they don't have the tools, and somebody maybe needs to help them, either give them the tools or put the words to what they're feeling so that they can process it. I think the one thing that also I hear a lot about with grieving and even with funerals is that people say, well, we need closure, right? We're going to do this because we need closure. And it's kind of a funny idea if you think about it, as if we can take something in our life that's very significant emotionally, physically, mentally, and we're just going to take it and we're going to deal with it, and then we're going to put it in the closet and close the door, and then we're done. Yeah. And then we don't do that with anything else. We don't do that with our joys. No. In fact, one of the things we love to do is open a photo album and revisit them. Yeah. We want to go and walk down and we can laugh again we can laugh sometimes as hard or harder at about something funny in the past, or a great time we had as a family or with friends than you did even in the moment. And there's something really therapeutic and helpful about that. But grief is the same, where you can revisit an experience, something that caused grief, and then as a family share again in that, or with a friend. And there's something very helpful as you continue to grow in that, to say, okay, this is a normal, natural response to what happened, and it's good for me to get that out.
Okay. Is that a helpful, like, say, tool to deal with grief for some people? Like,
or for everybody even.
Yeah, to revisit it, or, I mean, I guess it's not like we readily do that because it's, I don't know if you call it a negative emotion, but it's something that we don't obviously like to feel. And we obviously don't like to always like express that everywhere we go. But is that something that is helpful, like healthy to revisit, to remember, I guess, or just remember that those times, the people that we've lost? Is that?
Yeah, I think I got a bit sidetracked with what I was saying earlier. What I was trying to say was, at first how it's all consuming, but then as time goes, that does, like, how much it consumes you does lessen, even though it doesn't maybe feel that way in the first while that it would. But I think I think it's healthy, like whether it be on the anniversary or birth dates of people, just to acknowledge, maybe it's not even so much for you that you're like that you really need to acknowledge, but maybe other people in your family or loved ones. I really try myself to friends of mine who have lost people. I really try to make sure I reach out on those days. Do I think they maybe always really want to hear from me? Maybe not. But I think it's having your grief acknowledge that, wow, it's been a year since, my mom died, for example, and, everyone was there last year, and where's everybody today? So I think just having it, being able to, not saying you have to talk about it every time with people, but just being open enough to
Yeah.
you know, it was a significant event in someone's life. So
Yeah, I really like that. And also, my experience has been if you give people permission to tell their story about something that happened in their life, they will tell you actually with great detail.
Right.
They will remember the events leading up to it. They'll remember the event of the death if they were there.
Yep.
They'll remember how they felt, who was helpful to them, the things that hurt them, the things that confused them, to a very minor detail, the things they felt excluded from. Even I've met with people and doing funeral pre-planning, and then they end up talking about maybe they had a stillborn child, and years ago that often the mother was very shielded from it. She was still in the hospital for 4 or 5 days. The father might have gone with the minister to do the burial, and she was excluded from it. It all well-meaning. This needs to be done. Don't worry about it. We're not going to put this on you. We're going to look after it. And by the time you come home, we're going to try and normalize everything. If you can imagine, that doesn't even make sense these days, right? How would you normalize that?
No.
But then all of a sudden that conversation and allowing some voice to that, you get a whole story, and also how they felt about it and how they still feel about it. And
so in that example, did the mother miss out on closure or not? Because we just talked about closure is not really a thing.
Yeah, no, and that's what I'm getting back to. It when I brought up closure, I believe grief is about opening.
Okay.
So what happened is the door was not actually open for that person to express it, or to even allowed to, with permission, feel it. The encouragement was, let's move on.
Right.
Let's move on. Trust God.
Yep.
We trust in God. We know that this baby's with God.
Yep.
And now we move on. But what's happened is a big step has been missed as to, well, how do I feel about that?
Yeah.
How does that affect me?
Yep.
How does that affect me even trusting God that this was a good thing?
Right.
So those are all things that are need to be worked out and shared and are very healthy for people to do. But often the pressure to get over, to fix, to close the door, pushes that away. And so I think healthy grieving is all about opening the door. I think a funeral is not about getting closure. It's about opening the door to say, we can talk about this. We're allowed to feel this. We're allowed to talk to God about this, each other. And this won't go away. This is something we will live with for the rest of our life, but we will figure out a way to manage it and to actually, for it to be helpful for us.
Yeah.
Because life is full of starts and stops. This will not be the only grief we have.
No.
It's going to keep happening.
Yeah.
Until Jesus comes back.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I just finished reading Reverend D. Gelder's book, A View from Above. And one of the big things in there is when Jesus comes back, there's going to be no more grief. Because death is gone, brokenness is gone, the stops are gone.
Yep.
In fact, it even says in there, which I hadn't even contemplated, that the sort of the marriage feast of the Lamb is like this eternal banquet that goes on.
Yeah.
It's not, there's no, there's the come down from the big feast we had. No, it's just eternal. There's no come downs.
Right.
So that's pretty amazing to think about. We can't even kind of wrap our heads around it. But in this life, there's lots of come downs, right? There's lots of times where we have to say, well, now I have to let that go. And I have to be able to move on. How do I do that?
Right.
Who can help me? Right. And that's what grief's all about. Who can help me figure this out?
Yeah, I kind of want to touch on that because we've been talking about, a bit from personal experiences too, that people can deal with a loss differently. Well, maybe let's touch on first, in your experience, how does it differ when there's a sudden loss compared to a loss that is, quote unquote expected or something that has been foreseen for a while? Like, not just thinking of old age, but like, I don't know if all our listeners would know, but I've lost my mom a year and a half ago. But my mom had cancer for a year and a half, 2 years. I mean, probably getting the details way wrong, but so it was something that was expected, and we had a lot of time with her, especially at the end, and it was amazing. And but compared to somebody who loses their loved one in a car accident, I can't wrap my head around, even after losing my mom, I can't imagine having lost her that suddenly. So is there a difference that you've seen, just like, I guess, on the initial grieving process? Are you, when you come alongside somebody who's had a loss that's been expected, is that a different conversation at a funeral and then after, or how does that?
Yeah, I
you?
think the initial, like when we sit down with the family, it's a bit different when a family has had some time to process what's going to happen. And they've probably even talked about what they want to do in terms of visitation and service. And they've had a bit of time. So they have a lot of the questions already answered type of thing. Whereas the sudden losses, I feel like the initial appointment with them is kind of just even getting them to, I don't know if gaining your trust sounds bad, but just they're in such a fog that shock, and they don't even know what information we need or what their options are. And so it's a different type of appointment, I feel,
I see, right.
and can sometimes, lead to it being either a bit longer or needing to kind of leave them with some information and let them kind of process things. And especially if it's a family who's never talked about what their wishes are. Right. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think if you kind of channel that even a little bit more towards grief, one of the things we learned about also in school is that there's anticipatory grief. Right. So in the instance of with your mom, you have a time where you know that's this is terminal. And you're grappling with that. What does that mean? How does that look? And I think what happens is people even try to envision for themselves what that will mean.
Right.
And then you have already some grieving that there's moments that are great that you can share, but there's also sadness that you're leaving. And we're having a hard time accepting that or preparing ourselves for that or knowing what we're going to do about that when it actually happens.
Right.
And I still think it's jarring when it does happen. Most people say that, I kind of thought I was prepared, but it still hit me. And that's because that's when it's real. Everything else before that is anticipating a situation that you haven't really found yourself in completely. And then all of a sudden you're in that situation.
Yeah.
And, but I think that's for many people, grieving starts ahead of time in those situations versus someone who didn't see it coming. Right. I mean, the only grieving that I think most parents have is the worry that something could happen to their kids.
Right.
And if you let your mind go there, then you would already have some anticipatory grief.
Right. Yeah.
But you're not expecting it. You're still hoping that would never happen to them. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Is that something that is used for people? Like, I guess as a parent too, every once in a while your mind goes to that. Like what happens if, or what it would be like to lose, my family or my loved ones, my kids.
Right.
Is that something that helps people understand? Like, I guess in my experience, it's like it's still, it still hits you, right? And it's different than what you thought it would be. Even, I can't say it's say maybe worse for everyone. Maybe people can imagine it, worse than it is, but it's totally different, I guess. But I guess, is it healthy to, have not a vision of that, but to entertain that thought, especially as Christians, to know that, to work through the comfort of it already prior to even experiencing anything like that.
Yeah. I think the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible is all about that, isn't it? Is to coming to terms with the fact that there's a time for everything, a time to be born and a time to die. And that part of living a healthy life or even on earth is that we need to reckon with that, with our mortality. And then also that I think from a faith perspective makes us more acutely aware of the need for eternity, right? In that relation with God, that everything we have here is just for a time and a season and it will be gone and it'll be passed on. I mean, I kind of always gets me how the writer in Ecclesiastes, and then someone else is just going to take my stuff, right? I could build everything up to something, but it's just going to be left to somebody else.
Yeah.
And then even relationally, we have that in the sense that your relationships are only in this world for this time that we have them. And then there's eternity, but eternity, our relationships will be better, but changed, right? There's going to be no marrying. There's going to be, so it's going to be different.
Right.
And that's going to be far better than what we experience now. But I think that's some process that all of us have to work with. And I think even the unbeliever is faced with it, but is often trying to avoid it. Right? How can I avoid having this? Because if you have no answer for that,
it's not a question you want to face.
Then you just want to, like, today, I live for today, because there's no point in paying too much attention to the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
so
true.
I think So I think that's the interesting thing about grief. And I think one of the other things about it from a Christian context, now that we're kind of circled in on that, is that often people feel the burden that their grief is opposed to faith. So if I have faith, I believe in God, I trust.
Right.
I don't need to grieve. I just turn my eyes upward. God will make this all make sense to me.
Yep.
But I think if we look in the Bible, that's not the way it is. In fact, even in the Bible, it talks about God grieving. So God grieves over his people who have turned their back on him.
Yep.
When he was going to flood the world.
Yeah.
He said, I regret
Yeah.
that I made these people, and I'm grieved that they don't love me.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a huge. So there's this tight relationship between grief and love. And then you see that with Jesus. Jesus at his friend Lazarus' death, there's a lot going on there because he's also looking forward to his own death and burial and conquering the grave. But in that, there's that short little verse that Jesus wept. And then there's the commentary where the people say, and the people said to each other, see how much he loved him.
Yeah.
So there's this really tight connection between love and grief.
Right.
And there's a well-known quote from Queen Elizabeth right after 9/11. She's issuing a statement to give some consolation to the world, really, but also to the United States. And she said, grief is the price you pay for love.
Yeah.
And the significance of that was she was trying to honor their grief, to say, you're grieving because you love. And that's a high testament to you that you care about these people. That's the human condition. But the other side of it was that it made it very clear that if you're going to love, you're destined to grieve.
Yeah.
You have no choice. It's the other side of it.
Yeah.
Right. When something you love is taken away, you need to grieve.
Right.
And it takes energy and effort and thought, and just like love does. Love is hard work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's often denying yourself, doing all these other things.
Right.
But grief is the same. It takes this whole process to work that out and figure out, what do I do with these feelings? And now how do I reorient them even to other people? Because this was so significant to me. Now, how do I turn the page on that?
Right. You earlier you used the words like letting go of your grief. Is that in contrast to the grief as a process that never really ends? But is the letting go, I suppose, like you mentioned before, like the burden that you're able to bear it, is that just becoming comfortable and coming to terms with your grief and then being able to live with that?
Yeah, I don't know.
Like, is there a contrast there, or is that all one and the same?
That's always the challenge. So when you talk about, I look at grief as being a part of life, just like joy. And so it's that you're not trying to get rid of your joy. And grief is different because it comes with a negative, something has happened to you. Yeah, that is a negative in the sense of, in the grand scheme of things, you've lost something and you need to cope with that. But I don't think if you're trying to move away from it or get away from it rarely is helpful, right? So it's not, so I think never the pursuit of or working through grief should never be, now just how do I get this? What are the steps to get over this? But what am I actually feeling? Why am I feeling it? And what do I do with those feelings? So as a Christian, then it would be like to share it, but also to take it to God. I mean, the Psalms are all about that, right? Yep. The Psalms of lament are all about the fact that it's not that I've put my faith off to the side. It's in the middle of my faith. God help me figure this out. Because my life is turned upside down. My friends have turned against me. I've lost this, or I feel this, or I feel the burden even of my anguish on me. I can't stop crying. I can't. And it's never in the context, or rarely at least in the context of saying, oh, and then I realized I should remember you. Yeah. It's actually like in the midst of it, I remembered that, yes, you are still there for me. In the middle of this, you are still there for me, and there's a purpose.
It's a sign of faith, really, because who else do you turn to?
Right.
In that time.
So I think that, I guess that's where we started, is that often there's this, I think for Christians, this idea of like, is it permissible for me to feel the feelings I'm having, the struggles I'm having? Because I don't know, are other people looking at me, or am I even looking at myself as if my faith is really weak right now, and that God could not be happy with this? Yeah. I think the Christian community, the obligation is to say, no, that's not true. Yeah. But you are suffering, and we're here to walk with you and also remind you about how God understands.
Yeah.
How Jesus was the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief.
Mm-hmm.
There's not another person who knows more than him
Yeah.
about what you're feeling and experiencing,
Right.
and how significant that is.
So for the people who, I say, like, maybe haven't experienced grief or haven't experienced the same grief as someone else, and as they come alongside, this is kind of coming from, there was a post confession talk that I heard once, from Psalm 90. The verse was, teach us to number our days. And that he spoke on that as in, like, it's good for us, even if we haven't experienced grief in our family or a loss in our family or a loss close to us, to attend funerals, to not just see what people are going through and kind of help them with it, but to understand and, like, to put ourselves into a situation where we're understanding the loss of life and then the hope that we have as Christians. So how important is it for people to kind of like get inside that world a little bit to help support those who have lost? Is it helpful to, attend a funeral just to, I mean, when you're at a funeral, like, you just a feeling that you have, right? To that you're like, oh, there is something. And you, like you said, like, I guess both of you, what makes you get into it is there's something about it that just grips you. That is that like something that people can do to, help with, other people?
I'm not exactly sure how to answer that, actually.
Okay.
You haven't had people come to your funeral.
It reminds me of that kind of well-known poem by John Donne, where for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Every man's death diminishes me. So there's this awareness of that when someone else dies, whether it's even in Christian community or just in general community, that I'm mortal too. This could happen to me. This could happen to my loved one. So there's that reminder. I could see where the person who was teaching that was trying to say, don't avoid funerals to say, because you don't want to deal with that. Actually, those are therapeutic moments for all of us to say, we are all standing in the same place. Our life is just a thread of between breath and not breath. And that's all at God's mercy that we continue living. Right. So I think there's a great benefit of that. And then there's the whole other side of it, of community, that grief is just like love. Grief is never meant to be on its own. It needs to be expressed, because if you say, well, I'm a loving person, but you have no relationship with anyone, where's the evidence of that? Who are you loving with? Just yourself? So love needs a target. So grief is the same, that if you have grief, but I'm just holding it to myself and there's no expression of it, it has no value. It doesn't help me because I haven't shared it with you. I haven't kind of unburdened myself, and I haven't worked through any of it. I've just kind of hoarded it to myself. Or if people around me are saying, don't share that with me, by all their cues, their social cues, then they're actually blocking you from having a healthy expression of that.
Is that like most of what grief, maybe that's the wrong question, but is that part of grief, is a big part at least, is just sharing the story?
Yeah, maybe Diane can. So, I mean, if you just even think of what people do when they come to the funeral home.
Oh, yeah. Even when, like, you first meet with them, and, like, most of the time they're strangers to us, really.
Yeah.
And when you ask certain questions, like, most of the time, I'd say like 98% of the time, they want to share with you. Like, I've never met these people, so they want to tell you stories and what they were super interested in. And people will talk a long time about their loved one. They want to share because that's what's on their mind, right?
Yeah.
So,
and how do you respond to that? Like, because that's, I guess maybe I'm skipping ahead here in terms of helping other people deal with it, but is it just being there and saying, oh, like, that's very interesting, like, I'm glad to hear that you obviously had a special relationship with that person? Yeah,
listening is huge, whether that's at work, but also just with people in general. Sometimes they just need to talk, or they just need company, like someone to just be by them.
Yep.
But when it comes to our jobs as funeral directors, it's also to guide them in a way to be able to have a service that's going to reflect their loved one, right? And have it be So that's kind of how a lot of those conversations start. And then they kind of turn into, what type of service that people like to have.
Yeah, and I think that's the other side of it, is that each person is unique. We have a lot of common, so you could talk about grief and common things about grief, but each person is unique. So their need is unique at different times too. So opening the door as a supporter by first of all having questions rather than answers, because our tendency, and maybe males are worse, I don't know, but to be problem solvers. We never look at that like a funeral, being a funeral director is we're like a problem solver. Like we're going to help you fix your grief or remove the object of your grief, or we're actually saying we're opening the door for you to express this. And we hope that this door opening in the funeral itself will help you and the community around you to continue that conversation as long as it needs to happen.
Right.
Okay. And not the opposite. That's why when people say, well, we need the closure, and I'm like, you need to open it. You need to keep the door wide open and let people express it. And one of the biggest disappointments for people that we'll often hear about afterwards is the people who wouldn't let the door be open, right? The people they counted on even as maybe their close friends, who were unable to talk to them about it, who wouldn't mention the name of the person who died, who wouldn't even engage the subject, right? They'll meet with you and have a conversation as if nothing happened, right? Because they think they're helping you because, I don't want to make you upset. I don't want to bring you to a place that maybe is uncomfortable.
Right.
And they're also feeling, I don't know what to do or say if you get upset.
Right. Yeah. That's
I don't have a solution for your problem.
Yeah. I know. That's kind of what I was getting at there.
Right.
I'm like, okay, what do you do?
And the solution is just to be the person who asks the question.
Okay.
And then is willing to take the time to listen to the answer.
Yeah.
Because the answer can be long and it can be teary. It can be repetitive. People, I think one of the biggest things when I've experienced, my experience is people need to tell that story over and over again to process it. And that story can have variations, but it often centers around what happened, how it happened, their regrets. If I had done this, maybe I had done that. I don't know if I did the right thing.
Yep.
Maybe if we'd gone to the doctor earlier, maybe if we had all those types of things that they just need to process and run through.
Yeah.
To be the person who sits there and patiently listens and says, oh, that's really hard, or puts an arm around them, or in a Christian context says, you know what, can I just pray with you about that God would help you work through that, but not be solution oriented to say, what do I need to do to get rid of this grief problem that you're experiencing?
Right. Yeah.
Right. That's our impulse. It's not just in Christian, it's in society.
Yep.
That is our impulse. We're uncomfortable with grief. So we're usually our reflex is to say, how do I knock this down?
Yeah.
How do I get out of this conversation?
And I've had families that, we go through the funeral process, and then, they're done that. They're like, oh, that's over. Okay. That's over. It's good. And now we can move forward. And I'm always like, yeah, in a way, but it's actually kind of just beginning for them at that point on the day of the funeral. That's when their grief that's when their journey is really starting. So sometimes you feel bad being the person that's like, yeah, you got through this and that's great. But unfortunately, it's actually going to get worse.
Does that come from like an anxiety about the event of the funeral for the people who have to,
that they wanted, that they're like, oh, it's over. That's good.
Yeah. It's like if you were anxious about doing a speech or something.
Right.
Or
I definitely think there's there's anxiety ridden. And I feel bad for families sometimes. Especially the ones who are delivering the eulogies and stuff like that. I feel like the whole day, they're not even present because
they're not grieving. They're
nervous.
Speech.
And I totally get that. But just everything, knowing that you're got to be at the funeral home at this time and who's all going to be coming. I'm going to see all these people. And
will I be able to keep it all together?
Am I going to be a mess? Am I like all these expectations we put on ourselves that I think there's a lot of anxiety with. It's like a wedding day too, though. There's so much anxiety that comes with those days too. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think any big event like that is always going to have that. I don't think there's a way to avoid that.
I think that's where the rehash comes in. My wife's family is like they're professional rehashers. They can just have a great event or a sad event and then they immediately will rehash it, talk about how they felt about it, how it went. And then they will, maybe in a week's time again, they'll rehash it again or the next time they're talking. and because we can't capture everything in one moment, even in a funeral, you could have it all best planned, but as a person, you can't absorb all the things, the feelings, the interactions, but you can reflect on them. And then suddenly afterwards, you think, that person said that to me, and that was really encouraging or helpful, or that really hurt that person said that. And now I'm really struggling with that, or I really appreciated the message that I heard. We're in the moment sometimes, or the hymn that I heard, and it starts to resonate for you. And that's part of grieving. That's just, it's like, like I said, it's not different than joy. Joy, we take those moments and we try to absorb a great time, but then we want to talk about it again to kind of keep picking up the fragments of it and say, wow, that was a good time. Remember, I had this conversation with this person, or we did that, or remember when that person did that. That was hilarious.
Yeah. Right.
Grief is the same, where we kind of have to keep working our way through it, and what happened, who said what, how did it happen, how did that hit me? I couldn't absorb it all at the moment.
Yeah.
But I can carry it with me. And then it's even, I think, people, whether they're faith-based or not, always talk about memories, right? And that's why memories do bring some consolation to us, that we can revisit things.
It's part of the story. It's
part of the story, but it also brings us back to try to pick up something that we felt or experienced at that time that made us feel good, or made us feel safe, or was a moment of sharing love. Like, and just like, okay, I can somehow grasp still something of my partner's love in this memory for me, because I can't experience it now. One of the interesting grief examples in the Bible, I think it's in Acts, and Paul, and I'm not even sure which group of people it is. Somebody can look this up, but he's visiting there. He spent his time there, and they've had the bond of him establishing church and all that comes with all that, the sharing, and he has to leave, and they know that, realistically, he's never coming back here.
No.
He's getting on a ship. He's getting older. There's no way he's going to do a loop back here again. There's a lot of other places to see. And it says that they're crying and grieving. And what they're grieving most about is that they won't see his face again.
Yeah.
They will not be able to sit across from him and say, you and me, we're just
Human
sharing
connection.
this moment, right? They can remember him and remember all the things he said, and they can read the letters in the Bible, whatever, but it won't be quite the same ever on this side of eternity that they can sit face to face again. And I think that's what grief is all about. Us coming to terms, the fact that we can never sit face to face with that person again and say, hey, how are you doing? This is how I'm doing.
Yeah.
And share. All we can do is remember it.
Yeah.
And try to relive it some way.
Yeah.
So grief is about letting that go somehow.
Yeah. So
and coming to terms with that.
Coming to terms. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, because in my experience too, it's the little things like you mentioned, like that you don't think necessarily that you'll remember. I like that you put it that you guys are quietly central in like this time. You're there. You create an atmosphere that these things can happen. Like the funeral can go on and give people the opportunity to, whatever, act within this environment that you create. Yeah. Which, even with my mom when she was in the hospital, some of my, like, I don't know if you say fondest memories looking back, even at the time she was in the hospital, which was a tough time, are their memories that I didn't think at the time were like, this, I'm going to remember this. Like, and some of the moments that I thought, this is something that I could have to make sure I remember them, but they're not like, they touch me like the other moments. So, and then even about the funeral service and the funeral, like, the funeral home where we had so many people come through, like just every once in a while, it'll hit you little things like, oh, I remember that person who came through that line, and like there were hundreds of people, and why do I remember that? And why does that touch me? And you just don't know what these things are. So, and I think our community is within what you make, like, or create as funeral directors, like, we have a very good support of like how these things are constructed to create those moments of remembrance and then support too. So,
no, I think that's a great way to capture that. I think that's, what, nobody wants to be at the funeral home. We know that. Nobody wants to be at the graveside, but some of the most poignant moments are at the graveside or at the side of a casket, where you're just coming to like grips with reality, your feelings, a depth of your person, even a depth of your relationship with God, with each other as a family and friends, where I'm always amazed at that. Like as a family, even often people, I mean, it can be different, especially if there's a lot of trouble in a family. Then it can be different.
Right.
But if a family is reasonably close together, around a funeral, they get even closer together, and they actually don't want to be apart from each other for a while.
When Jay died, after it was like the reception was over at my parents' house and whatever, I was like, everyone's exhausted, but it was like, so we're not done hanging out, are we? And we all went for dinner that night, and because it was like you're spending all that time in the hospital and with him and over the funeral days, and it's like, I want to keep hanging out with these people and talk, rehash things about what was meaningful to me, or what was I hurt by? And
I think part of that is because that's a time when we've made ourselves more vulnerable to each other than we normally would. And so we've opened this door to each other, and those are the people who are most understanding you, who are sharing this grief burden with you. You really relate to each other, and there's a sense you don't want that to end.
Yeah, you've opened up the love side of it too, right?
For sure.
So
and it's just like, this is really helping me to be with you and to be able to just openly talk freely about this, how I'm feeling, how you're feeling, how we're missing this person.
Yeah.
And it's almost an environment you can't recreate.
No.
You can only get it in fragments again going forward.
Yeah.
As someone opens the door for you, or you push it down yourself and say, I'm going to talk about this, whether you want to hear it or not.
Yeah.
Which I think one of the other things was relationally. I think one of the things we talked about ahead of time was how do people grieve together, right? In a household, like a brother, sister, or parents, particularly. I think one of the high statistics in society is that when a death of a child can really fracture a marriage relationship.
Yeah.
And it's not because the people didn't love each other before that, and all of a sudden this exposed that, is I think they're having such a hard time communicating with each other their grief, and nobody's helping them to say that's okay. We don't have to do this exactly the same. But how do we find a way that we each lean into each other to do the thing that we need to do for that other person? And maybe back and forth, kind of have this ebb and flow. And where one person buries themselves in their work and the other person can't even get motivated to do anything, or all those types of things. And then there can be this friction and this like, stop making me do this, or why can't you, even get up and do something? And
can you speak to that too? Like in terms of, we've talked a lot about, okay, here's how you can deal with your grief, and grief is a process and whatnot. It stays with you. But what are some negative habits in terms of both dealing with grief as an individual and then also trying to support other people who are dealing with grief, like husband and wife, any sort of relationship, really?
I think just knowing, kind of, not that you have to know all the exact right words to say, but just, not like diminishing people's feelings in terms of, I know, and not just in the Reformed community and other Christian communities, sometimes you hear people saying to the grieving people in the visitation room, like, this was God's will. And well, yes, they're well aware of that, but not always the easiest to wrap your head around right in the moment. Or one thing I guess I would say from the outside that I struggle with is just sometimes with the body, and a lot of times families will say, oh, it's, it's just the shell. It doesn't, and yes, you're right in that extent. They're with God now, but the shell, that person, that body, we love that body, and it's okay that we did, right? It's okay that we're sad when we're seeing them for the last time, or we're closing the casket. Even if you're well aware that, you have your faith and where that person is that you love, I think it's okay to just let people still be sad about that and seeing their loved ones. And and
I think you're right. I think some people are trying to help themselves by saying that to avoid the emotion around it, or trying to say, well, this doesn't matter. I don't want to dwell on this,
so
because
like a stoicism that kind of sneaks in
a
there?
little bit, or their souls with Jesus. But I think, Heidelberg Catechism hymn, our Lord's Day 1, is the one that we recite all the time, that body and soul, both in life and death, I belong to Jesus Christ. So even though the soul is with Christ, we should also say the body is his.
Yeah.
And what we do with it is important, and we don't have to be ashamed to look at it, and also to carry it carefully to the grave.
Yeah,
right?
It's a temple of the Holy Spirit. We're supposed to honor it throughout our lives.
There should be still a high degree of honor there. And we're still respecting that each family would have their own way around that. But I think when it sounds dismissive, then I think people are just generally trying to protect themselves.
Yeah.
Getting back to maybe healthy responses in grief or when you can see maybe something isn't going well.
Yeah.
I think it's like in a lot of other things in life that if someone is self-medicating to cope,
Sure.
right? So whether alcohol, drugs, prescription drugs, whatever it is,
Yep.
That they're trying to cope by that because they're trying to numb themselves rather than. So then it might be like, okay, someone needs to help by stepping in and giving them tools to express what they're feeling and also an opportunity. So that's something we could easily be aware of. Or for ourselves, if you're grieving and you see this is where I'm spiraling, I'm isolating from others.
Right.
I don't want to talk about it. And I'm actually trying to find other ways to cope. And sometimes people even just try to rearrange their whole life. They just go full bore ahead, right? I'm going to start new relationships. I'm going to sell my house. I'm going to do all kinds of things. But I think we can see that from supporting communities that, are these the best decisions for you right now?
Or are you just running away from
Are you trying to run away from something because you hate how you feel?
Yeah.
Right. Which is very understandable.
Yeah.
You hate how you feel or you don't even understand it. Never felt this way before in my life.
Yep.
I think it could be in any loss, but spousal loss is a big one, right? Where people are like, I've never felt this disoriented. I've always been able to sleep and now I can't sleep. I've always had a good appetite. Now I don't feel like eating. I easily got along with my friends and now I feel stupid every time I go out because I'm just me and I'm single and I don't even know how to be single.
Yeah.
Right.
So as a supporting community, we should have a good awareness of that and say, well, how do we do that with somebody? How do we support them? How do we also see that maybe they could be heading down the wrong road and maybe come alongside them? I heard a good thing the other day on a podcast where they talked, it was it wasn't about grief, but it was talking about as a Christian, are you either a gatekeeper or a guide, right? So am I going to be the person that says, hey, you're not grieving right? Right now, you shouldn't be doing this, or you should be doing that. You should be feeling this way. You should be back in the game, or you should be taking a seat in the back bleacher for a while. I think that's not the point. It's more like, how do I walk alongside with you? And then when you need me to give you an encouragement or whatever, I can say, hey, I can relate, or I can't even relate, but I feel your pain. Let's pray about it. Let's talk about it. Let's work our way through it. What's a manageable thing for you to do today? Don't worry about a year from now. What can you do today? What can we do together?
Yeah.
Kind of break it down a little bit, right?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Like, just from experience, like my family, I guess we have the full range, but we all dealt with grief differently and we still are, obviously. But, well, this just reminded me when you were talking, so Lucas was working for me when my mom passed away and we spent a lot of time in the hospital, and Lucas actually asked me after the funeral, like, what do you want from us? Like, do you want us to, talk about it all the time? Do you want us to just move on? Like, what do you want? And that gave me, and like, I wouldn't say I was worried about it. And, we have a good relationship, but knowing that, like, he had kind of dealt with that in our office, and then I can still come back and just be me. That was what I needed. And that was super helpful. So, good job.
Like, break the ice almost, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But in a very practical way. And that's something that I actually really appreciated. But I don't think I ever told you that before.
No, I heard that. But we have a similar personality that way. So
Right.
I took an educated guess
Nice
there.
bro moment on the podcast.
Yeah, I feel like you guys need to hug or something.
No, but that was really helpful for me. But I know that's not everyone's way that it needs to happen. So even so I've been thinking about the different ways that we grieve. And we were talking about the funeral, even the visitation, and people chatting about and trying not to make it a personal thing, trying to keep conversation normal. And I know that that is helpful for some people, because as soon as you start talking about it, then it's very difficult.
Right.
But on the other hand, not talking about it's difficult for some people. And yeah, I'm just trying to get to these, it's not really unhealthy ways to deal with it. But then if you see somebody say what you said, rushing into things and making crazy decisions right after some event. Yeah. I mean, obviously everyone would be oh, okay, let's maybe go and talk to them. But if you have say you're making pictures of, or having pictures of the person on your phone and your computer, and you're surrounding yourself with the images and the memories, and you're like, putting that in your own face all day long. Is that like, are the indications like that something that at some point you need to, as a supporting person, talk about and help people? Like, I don't know. Maybe that's not healthy. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. I think that gets to this whole discussion, and Diane could probably add a lot to that, even from her own experience, as to how different people experience a loss, and the different roles in their relationships would mean different things as to how they process it all. So I think a relationship with someone would be a big part of that. Am I the person who has the relationship with that person to even talk to them about that?
Right.
Or is that someone more closer to them who should be doing that? Like,
yeah, even to that point.
Right. Am I a gatekeeper speaking in because it's none of my business, really?
Right.
Because I'm looking at you and I think, I don't know if that's healthy. I should ask you about that. Or am I intimate enough with you that I can say, hey, tell me about that.
Right.
Well, tell me why you're doing that. Tell me, how does that make you feel
to
do that? And then you start to understand why the person is. And it could be that for a time that they're just trying to keep the presence of that person alive. They're afraid they're going to forget. They're trying to hold on in any way to, like, how do I still have the feeling of that person's love for me?
Right.
Because I'm having a hard time figuring out that I won't lose that completely. Yeah. So that's a process thing. But I think there's lots of dynamics in a family, even how other people interact with a family. So who do they give most credence to as the grievers, and who are the other people who are just sort of considered the support of the bystanders, who also may be grieving?
Right. Yeah. That's big too. Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of that, I think when you're asking someone, like when people would ask me after Jay died, like, oh, how are your mom and dad doing? That must be so hard for them. Definitely it's hard for them. But then if you're asking that question, then maybe also follow up with, and how are you doing? Which is something so simple, but I feel like that kind of gets lost a lot. Like it
might be part of that, like you were talking about earlier, where it's easier to ask someone like, oh, how are your parents doing?
Right.
Than to get to the nitty gritty, like, how are
then
you
what
doing?
If I start bawling my eyes out, and then what do you do?
Yeah. Then
right.
Like,
but you almost have to be ready for that, I guess. I don't know, in a way.
If you're going to ask the question, you should be ready to hear the answer. You're right. Yeah. And that's not only in grief, that's in a lot of things in life, right?
Fair enough, yeah.
If you're going to ask the question, you should be prepared to take the time and also digest the answer.
It's really hard to know how that hits. Like for me, if someone says, oh, like, how's your dad doing? That question never bothers me.
Right.
But for some of my other siblings, like, yeah, but I'm also here too. And like, I've never really felt that. But also around the graveside or at the funeral, the range of, like, I would say, like, emotion is totally different too. And I might be more on the side of, like, I'm afraid I'm not showing enough emotion.
Right.
But, and then I guess sometimes, like, you're like losing the feeling of it. Like you're losing the feeling of what that person meant to you. And like, I don't know, maybe it's more like a rationality. You're like, well, I know I'm not going to, but
I think that ties back into what we were just talking about, like with how some people really, especially at first, really do surround themselves with, like, they carry the memorial card around everywhere. They keep the pictures up, pictures in every room of the person. Like, I've seen that before, and I'm sure it could come to an unhealthy amount of time. But I think at first, some people just, they're trying so hard to hold on to that feeling. And that's the only thing that they can think of at that time to.
And and there's a whole issue of honoring the person who died. Like, there's some people who the children are horrified that mom was cleaning out dad's closet within a few weeks of the funeral.
Yeah.
And that's something she needs to do and rather than saying you're wrong doing that, they should say, why are you doing that? Because I think the person is hoping that this will be helpful for them to do this, and they're processing in a way, right? That if I do this, maybe this is what my responsibility is, or this is how I feel I can best do it.
Yep.
But you get to know more by asking the question. To say what you're doing is wrong, you should wait 3 months or 6 months, or it's a year that you wait before you get rid of the clothes. And the opposite could be the truth, where the person who keeps a memorial almost for the person and by keeping their stuff, and you could judge it and say, wow, it's been a couple of years and you still got a lot of dad's stuff in the closet, or you're still kept all mom's things exactly where she had them.
Yeah.
But it's better to ask than say, hey, I noticed that. Why do you do that? How does that make you feel? is that giving you some comfort? Like to explore that with somebody is more helpful than to judge it.
Yeah.
Right.
Because it's part of them processing and reorientating themselves around the reality that someone died.
Yeah.
Right.
I think the whole thing about people feeling missed in grief can happen in family relationships, especially. And there's a fancy word for that, disenfranchised griever. So that's like someone who we usually think about that with voting, someone who should be voting but can't vote because they can't get to the polls or they can't. So they're disenfranchised. Like they should be having a seat at the table. They should be able to assert something, but for something stopping them. And sometimes in these situations, it's like the focus of most people's sympathy is to parents, or the parents might be to the spouse, say, of the person who died, their child. They focus their attention there, and then the people, the rest of the siblings are like, well, what about us though? All you want to do is talk about how a hard time they're having or how hard time you're having. And people feel so selfish to bring that to the fore, right? As a disenfranchised griever, because you're like, I'm not trying to say that people shouldn't care about you. I'm just saying, could someone ask about me?
Yeah.
Right? Who will ask about me? And so I think an awareness of that in community is to say, well, who are those people in this group?
Yeah.
And I think often people gravitate together who had a common experience. So another person who had a spousal loss might say to you, but how are you doing?
Yeah.
I know when my brother or sister died, I just felt like I had nobody to talk to about it because it was all about other people.
Yeah.
And I even made it about other people and wasn't even open to my own awareness of how this was affecting me. And I had resentment because of it. I had resentment towards my parents or my sibling or my sister or brother-in-law. Because I'm like, well, this is all about you. Like, don't you know that we're grieving too? And we've got to carry on with our life. And so it's a very real thing. But it's also good to be really aware of it in community to say, well, who are those people? One thing around that I thought is helpful from Dr. Wolfelt. He's an American bereavement counselor, if you like, psychiatrist, who's done a ton of work in this area. He talks about finding your therapeutic third. So he basically says there's a third of people who will be helpful to you in grief. So they'll take the time to listen to you, understand you. Maybe you even will relate to them. Like if you say, I'm not a person who openly cries a lot, but maybe I'm a little bit more, I just need to process things a little bit more rationally or theoretically, that helps me also emotionally. Right. So you find people that will be helpful for you and you recognize that 2/3 of the other people won't be, because they'll be wanting to push buttons that you don't want to do, or they just don't relate to you, or they'll be correcting you, or or they don't even listen to you. They just talk, right? Yeah. They're just talking at you.
Yeah.
So he said, everyone should find their therapeutic third, those people that will be helpful for them in their grief, and recognize that the others, they're not bad people. They're just not helpful for you. Yeah. And you also fall into that. You're not good for everybody.
Nope.
But there's probably a third of people that you will relate to well, that might be on your radar, that you can say, hey, I can be there for you. And if we're all kind of have that in our mind, that who are those people I could help? Yeah. And who are the people that I'm just annoying? Yeah. And maybe be okay with that. Yeah. We can't be all things to all people. But we could all be something to somebody. Yeah. In grief.
Yeah. That's a challenge, though. You need to have a certain amount of emotional intelligence for sure.
Yeah, self-awareness for sure, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is tricky.
Yeah. So, not everyone regulates that themselves. Sometimes you have to regulate it even as the griever. Say, you know what? You're just not good for me. I'm going to avoid you for a while. And I'm going to talk to these people because you're not being helpful for me. You're actually hurting me and making me feel bad about my feelings and bad about that I'm grieving. And you may mean well. Yep. But you're being a gatekeeper or some type of a person who's just saying, don't do it this way. Do it like I do it. Yeah. Do it the way it works for me. And it'll work for you. Yeah. And that's often not.
Yeah. And as a griever, even you have to, like you're saying, advocate for yourself sometimes. Even with that comes to people inviting you out, or like when you're in a time where you feel people are trying to keep you too busy or whatever, like advocating for yourself of like, you know what, I'm not going to go to that, or I'm not going to go to this baptism or something. If, a woman who's had a miscarriage or is stillborn, like advocating for yourself. I don't have to do everything. If I don't feel like where I'm at with my grief right now, that's going to be helpful, then you're allowed to, take a step back or not go to certain events, or just kind of advocate for yourself, I think which is hard to do, because I think a lot of people feel like they just have to show up for everything.
Right.
And
Which just gets back to like having to show up for the funeral and people being relieved it's over, because it's like this is something that you have to go.
that
right?
you have to do.
Right. Yeah. So, but and it's healthy, but it's something like that. I think some people could feel that's like, okay, we have to do this, and then once we're past that, like then it's like I can deal with it. Like I want to deal with it.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. There is a social engagement part of it that is difficult. Some people it's very therapeutic for. Some people it's very difficult for. And then even I think as a funeral director, you have to try to have some awareness of that, especially if you've sensed it. Say, how do we create a protective space for you so you're not overwhelmed? Yeah, right. But you can still be part of it. And how do we also accommodate the people who want all the engagement and that's really good for them and they flourish in that? So I think you have to really be aware of that. And even in a family, I think as a parent, you kind of know your kids and it might not be all the same for each of them. Yeah, right. So even you think about birthday parties or something. For one kid, having a great big birthday party and all the bells and whistles is the thing. Yeah. And the other, like, just let me have my friend over and can we just go do something together? Because that's what I like. I hate being the center of attention. Yeah, right. So that you have those things that also play out in all the areas of life.
Yeah, because like every kid's cried at their birthday party.
Right.
Maybe it just wasn't for them.
Yeah. Maybe we should start asking what they want.
True, like
that's
that.
Funny, yeah.
In your work, do you like, is it done basically after the funeral's done, or do you help? Like, do you refer people to counselors or therapists or anything like that? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll talk a little bit about bereavement care, and then maybe you could talk about sort of what we do with family care. So we have for a long time run a program where we have regular peer group sessions. So you can sign up and join a peer group. It's community based. And there's usually a 10-week program. And the whole point of it is, first of all, it's never right after the funeral. We usually we say, you should actually wait at least 6 months.
Oh,
because
really?
When you come right away, you want to fix. You're looking to say, give me the 10-step program to feel better.
Yep. Right.
And that's not what it's about. It's actually about, what is my grief all about? What is it teaching me? What types of things do I have to do? So even things like time management, recognizing why I'm feeling certain ways. And so how do I manage that? What do I do? How am I reorienting my life? What decisions I'm making that are helpful for me and aware of why I'm doing them.
Okay.
And then also being validated by other people you're like, wow,
similar story.
I'm not the only crazy person. Everyone is feeling this way in some way about their loss. They're all feeling off kilter and they need help. And I'm not the only one. And then there's something really amazing that happens. Often these people kind of lean into each other, and in the group, they become supports for each other because they become vulnerable. It's like the funeral where the people you're close to, you become vulnerable. And then you have this like, we need to keep this going. You understand me, I understand you. And it's really helpful for us to have this time together. So a lot of times people make connections out of that.
Nice.
So we have that. And then we have some individual counseling too that could be arranged for. And that's often when people just feel they get to the point where they feel stuck. Like I don't know what to do, or they're in conflict over their grief with family. And sometimes even it's the family who calls it. Can you see mom? Like she's just not doing the way we want her to do. And the first thing we say, well, wait a minute. If someone wants help, they need to know that and they should be recognized. So they should be making the call. But maybe you need to just talk about what you're frustrated about. Okay. Because maybe your frustration is that you don't want to deal with your mom's grief.
Yeah.
Right? You want to move on and mom is treading water.
Yep.
And that's very normal because your dad only died 6 months ago and our life is turned upside down.
Yep.
And so maybe that's the conversation that needs to happen rather than say, how do we fix mom?
Yep.
So those are the two things we've offered as a funeral home. So try to be that support afterwards. And then there's been some that have been more focused also we have a number of moms that had infant loss.
Right.
And we see that. And then we say, well, do you want to form a little group together and have some help with that? And at times that's been helpful. Or suicide loss.
Yep.
So people have been dealing with that. So not only the shock and trauma of that, but also what led up to it came after, and the stigma. That's a whole other thing that complicates the grief because people don't feel like they can talk about it. Or other people speak into it in a way that's not helpful or not understanding. And
yeah, it's a tough one.
Is that a church community problem, or is that like just our culture in general?
I think that's culture in general.
Okay.
Yeah. Even the culture that's not faith-based still has difficulty knowing what to do with when someone takes their own life.
Right.
I think we're getting better to understand mental health issues and recognize that as a legitimate thing. But still, like to navigate all that.
It's murky waters.
It's
yeah.
murky waters, and also the situation around the death is often murky, right?
Yeah.
There's been either a suicide, someone took their own life, or there's been an overdose, or there's been and it's like, how do you deal with all that to be able to talk about it openly and feel supported?
Yeah.
Then the family care is a little bit more on the practical side of things.
Yeah, it's usually within like a week or so after the funeral itself, and we sit down with the family, and it's kind of more of a paperwork side of things, just helping them with government forms, getting necessary applications out, getting certain cards and whatnot canceled. But yeah, that's the work part of it, I guess. But it is a good opportunity to, I feel like, for them to even kind of debrief a little bit about how the service went and what they took from it and what they felt. Not even necessarily like our work services, but just how they felt after, what was meaningful to them, and just to kind of chat. And we always let them know we're here. It's not like, okay, we've done the paperwork and see you later. Like, if stuff comes up, questions, anything, just call us. And develop good relationships within not just the Christian community, but our community in Waterdown.
I think it opens a door for future, like, if they have needs, they could call us.
Right.
So not only just like, I got something in the mail I don't know what to do with, but I'm struggling with this, or I don't know. There's a place that they can turn to again. We've talked about that, sort of expanding our circle of care, that we encourage people to plan ahead. So have a healthy discussion about a funeral and what you might anticipate in doing that while you're well, as part of your retirement planning or whatever.
Sure.
But also have a good discussion if somebody is ill. Like, can we be the people to help facilitate opening the talk about that? Because often there's one or the other person who is unwilling to go there. And it might be the person who's dying, or they might want to talk about it with the person who doesn't want them to die, doesn't want to talk about it. But whereas there could be at some point in there, probably a healthy conversation for both people to say, this is real. This is how I'm feeling. This is how I'm feeling. How do we talk about this? Yeah. Because it's so emotional. It's so loaded. There's so much fear of the future. But if someone could help facilitate that discussion, I think there's just a whole higher level of intimacy around something really, probably the most difficult time in your life together that you're facing. That the door could be open for that. Yeah. I've never heard somebody say afterwards, if they had that opportunity, say, well, I really regret that we talked about this ahead of time. They're always saying, I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful we were allowed to have that conversation.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So if we can be a part of that, to even be the people, sometimes it starts with a practical thing. And so, well, we're just in case we're getting some cemetery property or something like that. Not planning to use it or whatever, but the undertone. And if you can open up that it's okay to talk about this,
right?
It won't make it happen, and also won't make it go away. But it can make it very open for when you need to share it with each other. To say, how are we doing?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about bringing in like a funeral home into that discussion, because first of all, I wouldn't know the questions to even, or the things to even think about necessarily. Like, like a cemetery. Beyond that, I'd be like, what kind of flowers do you want?
Right.
Yeah.
But then to have like, are you able to kind of like keep a kind of like a idea of what that looks like in your mind, that when that person then does experience the loss, they don't have to remember. That's the word again. All the ins and outs of what that person wanted. Like, like we write stuff down. Like, we'll start a file for someone if they would like us to, and just kind of what their wishes are with like, is there cemetery property? If not, where are you thinking of? Would you want to have visitation at the funeral home or at a church? Or, how do you feel about flowers? Do you want lots of flowers? Do you keep it practical with the one? There's just, and then when the time comes, often it's, the family comes in and it's like, oh, I didn't know mom wanted that, or I didn't know mom picked a light colored casket. I would have thought she'd pick it. Oh, but she picked it. That's nice. And like, it just takes a little bit of pressure off the people who are planning the funeral. Because a lot of the decisions have already been made. And some people go as far as like picking what hymns they want and what
what they want in their
scripture
obituary.
they want in their obituary.
Yeah, stuff like
Wow.
that.
Get very creative, but
I think sometimes to me the best prearrangement visits I've made is not the one that had all the details nailed down, but where I could sense that the door was open to have an honest conversation about what was happening.
Yep.
Right? That someone is dying, and that it's for both of you very upsetting and difficult to talk about. But if you could talk about it and work your way through it together, how much more better would that be? And it's going to open the door to anticipatory grief. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But to be able to grieve with the one who's dying,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that we always talk about the idea of being able to say goodbye to someone. That's essentially what you're doing in a really good way. It's like it's easier for the person who dies suddenly, who never has to face it in some way. But for the rest of the family, we always say, well, that's really hard. That's jarring. And there was no chance to say goodbye. And that's not about closure. That's actually about opening that discussion to say, you are dying. Yeah. And I'm going to miss you.
Yep.
And how are you doing about that, facing your death? And how are we doing together? And really, I think some of the most intimate, emotional moments would come out of that. If I think of relationships, whether it be spousal or with friendships or
parents, whatever.
And that's why I think hospice care is really intended to facilitate that, right? It's not just about you need the physical care. What is the emotional, who opens the conversation, right? And hospice, I think care is all about that.
Yep.
It's about let's be real about what's happening, and then let's help each other deal with that.
Yeah. How do you, I mean, I hadn't even thought about this, but how do you go about helping somebody who is dying? Because that's something that I look back on with my mom, and I don't know that like I supported her enough. That's one thing I think about every once in a while. That's like, we could have prayed more. We could have sang more. We could have and I mean, compared to other people and the experience that they have, like the way my mom passed away was amazing for her to get like a chance to talk to us all and everything. But there's always something that's like, oh, we could have done that a little better. Like, I feel like personally, like, my role in that could have been better. But is there is there some advice that you can give to people who like know that end's coming, and that, I guess, obviously the hospice is a big thing. We were pretty fortunate with my mom that she was in ICU for a while. She came out of ICU, and then they actually let her stay in a private room by herself. They were going to move her to a hospice, but they didn't, and she passed away like maybe a day or two later. So we would have been like a transition. So we actually, it was quite a blessing that we were able to stay in the hospital. Right. So we had a lot of family there, nice. And we had the opportunity there to have a lot of those conversations and stuff. But yeah, is there some advice that you can give to somebody who's speaking to their loved one who's in the last days?
Yeah, I think first of all, everyone will always have regrets, because we're always think, well, we could have done more. If I'd only done this, and that's actually just it's also a grief process. It's kind of like I'm trying to there's something is out of your control, and you're trying to imagine that if I had done something different, maybe that would have had a different outcome, or that would have been better. Or so we have that in relationship in general, right? I should have did this. I should have said that. Yeah. But I think one of the benefits of when people are engaging hospice is then at least the permission to talk about it has happened, that someone is dying.
Right. Yeah,
and that's usually the main thing that if you're with the closest person to someone who's dying, or the dying person themselves, if they can give permission to talk about it. Because that it does open up emotions, but it does open up a pathway to have a sharing, and that you don't have to lie there thinking about this yourself, and nobody's fooled. We all know what's happening. Or the person lying there says, I don't want to make this harder for the person, but wouldn't it be great if you could talk about how you are feeling that the fact that the person is going to be gone? I mean, there's always, I think, a little weird superstition in all our minds that if we talk about something, it's going to happen quicker, or maybe if we don't talk about it, maybe it'll go away.
Yeah.
And we know that's not real. But I think it's the same reason why when people travel, they go also get their wills done. It's as if sometimes that most people get killed when they're traveling. It's not true.
No. But
it's on your mind then, because you're all of a sudden have this little thought that, what if I don't return? How will this affect these other people?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So it's a similar thing by just giving some permission to have the conversation. But it's hard. I'm not saying I mean, I'm mortal and I face my mortality via other people all the time in my job.
Yeah.
But I haven't had to do that myself. To be the one, because there's almost a sense like you feel like you're giving up.
Yep.
And that's almost
Right.
like that could be the worst thing. Right?
Yeah, I know. Which strikes me as like, that's not what I want to do.
But you could say I'm not giving up, or you might say I'm not taking any more treatment, but let's talk about that. Why I'm not.
Yeah.
Or I'm taking treatment, but I also know that it might not go the way we want it to.
Yeah, just in case.
And can we talk about that?
Yeah.
And that goes back to what you were saying before about having that like discussion ahead of time, even if the funeral home's there or whatever, sometimes gives, like, I find sometimes the one who is dying can be, no, submissive is the word, but they just kind of want to be like, oh, just put me in a box and shove me in the ground and they'll be fine. Oh, dismissive. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah. Right.
Whereas then you have the other person and sitting there like, rolling their eyes. And it's like, this is your wife and she's going to be grieving and maybe she doesn't want to just throw you out in a cardboard box. So like giving them permission, I feel like, to have that conversation of, okay, this is actually serious and you need to have that talk.
Yeah. And actually think about the other person.
Yes. It's not only about yourself. It's also about the people around you.
Funerals are for the living.
Yeah.
Right. So the person least impacted by it is the person who has died because they have no experience in it. Right. Their body will be cared for in a certain way, but we believe they've gone on in their soul. But all the people who were vitally impacted are the people left behind. As to what are we doing? Why are we doing it? How does this help us?
Another thing that a little bit of what you said, when people ask, like sometimes we'll have people call and say, Dad's not doing well. And so they said to me, it's like, be a day or two and maybe we should come in and get all this stuff written down and do all this. And often we just say, like, right now where you need to be, if it's happening this quickly, is to be by their side. Like that's the important part. Whether you're saying the right thing or doing the right thing, I don't think that even matters so much. Just being there, right? Like that's where you need to be at that time. And then the rest will be here when it does happen to help you, if it's that close. So.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's good advice. Yeah.
Did you have anything you want? We got about like 5 minutes left if we want to keep it somewhat tight today. Do you want anything else you want to hit on there, Ty?
No,
I got a question otherwise.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
All right. Like maybe you both use this as like kind of your ending off sort of point here, but the last point we kind of got down here is like, if you want to reflect on some trends you've seen maybe over the years in your time at your work, specifically, I suppose, in our Reformed church community, how people are dealing with grief and with death. Hit us with maybe some positive stuff and some stuff that we could also try to change as well as a community. So I don't know if you want to go first, Rick or Diane.
All right, I'll go first.
Yeah.
I think I've seen some really positive things. I think, first of all, if I think of experience of friends who lost family members when I was in high school, there was a lot of uncertainty how to deal with that in the public setting of the school. And my friends have expressed to me they went to school and there was a palpable sense that the best thing people could do was just not acknowledge this even happened. Let's just carry on. If we could avoid the topic, maybe there'd be a prayer about it or something just to kind of set the right tone that right at the time. But often then the family wasn't there when that happened in the community. So when they reintegrated coming back from a funeral, that they just felt like, I feel like everyone is either looking at me or avoiding me and nobody is actually able to talk about this or do anything or say anything. And just felt real angst around that. Whereas I've noticed in previous or more recent years is that the school community engages with what's happened, recognizes that the grievers are also in the school community and create an opportunity for gathering, for talking about it, for some type of a memorial, if it's appropriate, where there can be an outward expression of grief, shared and openly and put in a context of hope. We think of 1 Thessalonians 4, we grieve as those who have hope, but we grieve and just permission to grieve as a community. So I see those as really steps forward, even that there's, Christian counselors available in the school, because
Yep.
that helps people like that to also find, here's someone who could maybe help me have the tools to know how to navigate this. So that's a good thing. I also think the church community really gets it and how to like support each other. Not only with sort of coming out for visitations and really supporting people, but reaching out. I think just about every time there's a death in the community, there's food. And I was reading a book recently, and this lady was reflecting when her husband died that the community expressed themselves in food. So like all the casseroles and things were coming.
Sure,
and this
yeah.
was people saying, I just want you to know we care about you. I know you need to eat. You're probably getting too many casseroles and your freezer's full. But anyway, this is the only way I know right now is how to show you something without being invasive, like demanding your time.
Yep.
So I think that's really healthy and rich in the church community, that the people are willing to share and I think talk about it more maybe than even the immigrant
mindset
community was able to.
Yep.
And this with no aspersion to them. I think they were dealing with a whole bunch of coming to a new country.
Sure.
You were grieving the loss of your old country. You left your parents behind or siblings or whatever. You had all kinds of things.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes it was a bit of survival even. Like
Yep.
you can't even go down this road.
No, just
sometimes.
keep on
It's just,
chugging.
okay, we just all have to pull together and carry on.
Yeah.
But so I think there's a lot of healthy things that have happened.
Yeah, and I think that maybe it's a generational thing too, but people are getting more involved in the planning of like their parents' services, and they want certain photos, and
Right.
they want to do the slideshow. They want to have they want to have input. It's not just it's a church service, but it's also a way to honor their loved one and to represent their life too, right? Their faith life, but also their life as a mom or, as a baker.
Sure.
Like I do find that becoming more common. Also, it's nice to see, I feel like more children being, coming to visitations and services. Whereas before I feel like it was, if you're, not 10 or 16, then you just stay home, like even within families. Whereas now it's like, no, everybody comes, and because everyone's grieving together, and to show that it's normal. There's nothing that these kids need to be afraid of in that way. So it's nice seeing parents putting the time in to like talk to their kids about it. And when they come in, showing them things, making sure they're comfortable. And so that's been, I feel like, a good thing to see, just the involvement that they want to have.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, totally.
Oh man, yeah, that's good things to think about.
Well, I've learned a lot. This has been fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, this has been great. I think it'll help people to know what to do when they're supporting someone, but also getting through and dealing with grief. So
Do you have any last
Much
minute thoughts
appreciated.
you want to get out before we end this? Both seem to be pretty content.
Yeah, no, I think we're talked out. But I mean, obviously we're in the profession we are in because we believe in it a lot, but we really believe grief is the natural, God-given way for us to deal with the stops and starts, ups and downs, death, other losses in life, and that we could do well as a community to support each other in that.
Yep.
Understand it, support each other, and just really respect it as a valuable part of our growth.
Yeah.
Christian growth, spiritual growth.
Faith-wise, yep.
Yep.
Totally.
yeah,
Well, we hope it's been helpful for all the listeners. And we'll
sure.
probably do a feedback episode on this eventually. So if people have questions, they can write in. And if we get stumped, which is likely, then we'll just forward them your way and
Sounds
see if we can
good.
get a couple answers.
Sounds good.
yeah. Appreciate your work. Like,
Yeah.
so many do. So
Yeah. Alrighty. Well, keep it on Real Talk,
thank you
folks.
so
And
much.
we'll catch you next time. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. You can send us your feedback by emailing us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. You can find us on social media by looking for the handle Reformed Real Talk. You can find us online by going to realtalkpodcast.ca. We look forward to your feedback, as that's what helps us grow and improve as podcasters. Real Talk is produced by myself, Lucas Holfluer, Tyler Vanderwoude, and Tim Van Woudenberg. The theme music was created by Calvin Hutton. The table and cabinet behind me were made by Ethan Vanderwoude of Eureka Woods. And finally, this sign in the studio was made by Zebra Signs. That's it for now, folks. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.